Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak on this amendment. I didn't have a chance at committee stage. I suppose I'm very concerned about the government's plans to essentially introduce a new or an expanded tax on inheritance. And I suppose, put simply, what the government is proposing to do is to limit tax exemptions for a parent who wants to provide support for their child if that child is over 18 or is not in full-time education, to €3,000 per year, and this is on top of the 33% lowering of the threshold over the lifetime for tax relief on gifts or inheritances from a parent to a child, which has taken place over the last 3 years, specifically since 2012, when these changes began. I suppose what I would like to highlight is the unfairness that exists when you start looking at the distinction that can be drawn between, for example, two children, one of whom goes directly into education, full-time education at 18, and another who may not, for a variety of reasons, particularly in the context of today's straitened times. Many children are not going directly into full-time education. They're delaying it, deferring it, or they're doing it in a part-time capacity, none of which is going to be covered by the exemption in the legislation any longer. And I consider that to be an entirely unfair scenario. Another example is where a child is over 25 who has faced illness or for some other reason and doesn't potentially benefit from the same exemptions as is currently the case. The Revenue Commissioners have promised, they issued a statement I think last week or the week before, that the changes would not include the imposition of a tax on board or lodging, food or other services provided by a parent to children over 18 or over 25, depending on the circumstances. But we don't have any detail, we haven't any clarity as to how the Revenue Commissioners intend to implement this amended legislation. And I believe that this information should be published prior to the adoption of this legislation, not afterwards. We just simply don't know how it's going to operate. €3,000 a year in tax-free gifts from a parent may sound somewhat reasonable. But what I suppose they don't say is that every gift from a parent to a child is included, and many of them are gifts that we would take for granted. For example, a deposit towards a house, payment for a wedding, which is the norm in this country, a car, starting up a business, for example. All of those payments or gifts valued above €3,000 in a year will increase the amount of tax liability for a child when or if they inherit from their parents. Currently, there's a lifetime tax relief, as you know, Minister, of €225,000. It's a significantly diminished amount from where it was a few years ago. This lifetime tax used to be linked to inflation in the economy, so that, and this has been the case for decades, that it would avoid a situation where, for example, house prices increase rapidly, that essentially children would be left with huge tax bills, huge liabilities on inheritance. This changed back in 2010 in order to meet various Troika targets, and it was done by removing, well, firstly the cap was lowered, but also indexation was eliminated, and that didn't have a particularly negative impact in 2012 when house prices were on the floor and so on. But things have changed. The average house price in Dublin now is €242,600, which is €25,000 above the current threshold for tax exemption for inheritance on one-off gifts. So if a parent dies in the morning and leaves their house to their children, they will have to pay a 33% tax on that €25,000 difference, and that's just an average house price, of course, in Dublin, and they're a lot higher than that. That's assuming, of course, that the parent didn't give them any other help along the way by way of the sort of gifts that I've just mentioned, whether it's a deposit or assistance with the loan for a business or wedding or whatever. If they gave them other assistance when they were over 18 or over 25, that will now be taxed at 33%, so that a child will, in essence, be paying on the double. So for every investment that a parent makes in their child over the age of 18, if not in full-time education, or over 25, in the case that they were in full-time education and above €3,000 a year, that same euro will increase the amount of their inheritance that will be taxed at 33% in the future. It is profoundly unfair. I think it mitigates against the sort of society where families help each other, where they're not reliant on the state for a whole range of supports that otherwise they would. To me, it's illogical. It makes no sense. And I suppose I just think it would be a little bit more honest if the Minister would tell us truthfully that this isn't a tax focused on the super wealthy. It's a tax that's actually going to affect ordinary people all over the country, the length and breadth of the country. That is the reality. The government is forecasting a 20% rise in the amount of revenue that they're going to collect next year. And I think, just for context, it's important to note that the number of deaths, just speaking on inheritance, the number of deaths which occurred in 2011 and 2012, according to the CSO, were basically identical. There was virtually no difference. But the tax collected on inheritance during those periods increased by 20%, which I think is illuminating, because it shows the intention of the Revenue Commissioners and the Department of Finance and the Minister. The intention is obviously to raise additional revenues by broadly applying this to ordinary citizens, I think the notion that this is about closing off a loophole for the super wealthy, it just doesn't stack up. The proof, I think, is in what has happened over the last few years, and the proof is also in the fact that this is going to apply to everybody right across the board, and it is going to disadvantage parents who work hard, who pay their taxes in an honest fashion, and who want to support and help children, particularly children who are trying to improve their lot in life, or children who have fallen on hard times and actually physically need financial support from their parents. They're now going to be punished for doing so. Thank you.